For Reaper Metal Productions, I am Adam of Unbaptized Records, here to make a brand new video for you today. Today is my part 3 of my Guilty Pleasures metal version videos. So, as I said in the previous 2 videos, I'm going to be doing a couple of videos on my quote-unquote Guilty Pleasures. I have my metal version and then my non-metal version. So in my non-metal version, I'll go over bands that I enjoy that I guess could be considered guilty pleasure, especially if you're like a Cavolt Underground black metal tough guy and you think nothing outside of a couple of bands is even worthy of being considered music, let alone like metal music. So again, this is part 3. These are all either obvious metal bands or metal adjacent, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a little bit, although you could probably figure it out. So my 2 caveats, as I've said in the previous videos, really quickly, you've probably seen them already, so I don't really need to explain much. But first caveat is I don't really feel guilty for these necessarily, but I can understand why. Most people in the metal scene, and specifically the underground metal scene, wouldn't be a fan of these releases, either of these albums by bands that are maybe true, but they're later albums. I mentioned Behemoth in a previous video. So early Behemoth people enjoy, but later stuff they kind of ignore, and I think they really shouldn't. Or it's just stuff that, like, overall people just generally don't like that I actually own, and I have no problem showing off that I own, because again, I don't really feel guilty for these per se, but I understand where that term comes from. And then number 2, and this one is equally as important, but if this is a band that you have heard of and you've never listened to a single song by, go ahead and say you don't like them because you assume you don't because of the people they associate with or the bands they tour with, or people that have come up to you wearing their shirt say, oh, you're definitely going to like it, and you know, you can just kind of tell by the person you don't. That's understandable, and for 99% of bands you're probably right, but my thing is you still have to listen to at least one song, especially if you've never heard a single song by the band. It's probably going to confirm your belief that you already didn't like it. That makes sense, but I've been guilty of this before. I've done this, and my friend called me out on it, and I totally understand. I said it for a movie. This was the remake of the Total Recall movie, and I saw it, and I'm like, oh, it's probably going to suck. And he said, why? You haven't seen it. I said, well, the original was good. How can the remake be good? Well, even if it is true, if you haven't seen it, you don't know. So just don't shit on something you haven't even heard of or seen or whatever. And I kind of agree, and I think especially with music, it takes a lot of time to dedicate yourself to listen to all the music out there, so that's why I listen to some albums just once for now. But before I shit on something, I want to at least hear a song or 2 by it, so I really know what it sounds like. So if you haven't even heard a single song, you kind of don't get to say you don't like it. You can say you probably don't. You're very likely certain you don't, 99%, but that last 1%, I mean, just give it a few minutes. You don't like it, that's fine, or just stop shitting on it. So that's just my opinion. These are my guilty pleasures, and this is part 3. So this is an example of a band very similar to Behemoth, where I just heard a later album by them first and then had to go back to the early stuff. So this is kind of a unique one, and this is Kreator with Phantom Antichrist. Now, this isn't necessarily, again, the traditional guilty pleasure, but I know a lot of people will talk about how a lot of bands, this is something I'm also kind of tired of, the first 3 albums were great, everything after that, I mean, who would even pick up the later Kreator? Well, me, I would, because I don't give a fuck. Yeah, okay, I didn't come into the scene knowing that the early stuff was the best. Makes sense, usually is for most bands, but when I started to get into metal, and I started to buy a lot of the physical music around 2016, 2017, this was just one of the albums. I mean, this came out like 2012, but this happened to be on the shelves. I think this is a new cover too. I don't actually care for this cover much. I like the original one better, where it's got some like God with a, this is kind of like a giant like God of War type creature coming out of the water with his hand. I thought it looked a little cooler than this, and actually that could be a whole nother video of bands or labels or whomever that changed album art, and I kind of like the originals better, and I wish they hadn't, but for various reasons they changed the album art. So this was a good introduction to the band. Granted, it isn't a very great album compared to their old stuff. I do get it, but I have a few bands like this, like Destruction's another one, where I just happened to come into the scene late, picked up one of their later albums, liked it, and that got me into the band, and it got me to discover their older stuff. Same with bands like Vader. Same with bands like, I mean, the first Cannibal Corpse album I bought was the Wretched Spawn. I thought that album freaking sucked, and I'm glad I listened to the older stuff. The first The first Morbid Angel album I ever picked up at the same time as that Cannibal Corpse album was Domination. I think that album's absolutely horrible. I'm so glad I checked out their earlier stuff. But then there are bands like Creator that changed their sound dramatically, I guess, but I still think this is an okay album. So I do kind of throw into my guilty pleasures. You know, it's later albums by bands that are known for their first couple albums, and people just stop caring about them, but they're still around, they're still putting out music. So I don't see that necessarily as a bad thing. I see it as just checking out their music. I don't see it's that deplorable, but I do see it being worth going back to their older music. So kind of in the middle there. Next one's going to be kind of an interesting pick. This is the band Gore Rotted. They only have 3 albums, then they changed their band name to The Rotted, and they became more just like basic death metal. And even then, there was one album called Ad Nauseum, which I heard. It was actually pretty good. This is their 3rd album. So you can see it's kind of reflective there, but it's called A New Dawn for the Dead. It's not that bad, I think, because their first 2 were just so unique and so extreme. So Mutilated Minutes and Only Tools and Corpses. I own those 2. I own those on CD, and I own Only Tools and Corpses on LP. I'd love to own the picture disc of the first album as well, which is pretty cool, but I think this is still worth checking out. It's not quite as bad as people say it is, and it's not quite as tame as The Rotted. This is still a decent album, and they only have 3, so I mean, you have a pretty tiny discography to deal with anyways. So yeah, the first 2 albums are definitely better, but this is still a pretty decent record. I still think it's worth picking up, especially if you're going to buy it for like, I don't know, $10 or something. And it was on Metal Blade, which is kind of interesting. So I actually didn't really know that until looking at it, but it's not that bad of an album. So I would definitely still give it a listen. And if you think this isn't very good and you have given it a listen, don't even bother with The Rotted, but their music's okay too. It's just sort of like any other band, like maybe Sarcophago, where the first album's so good and everything after that isn't great, which I actually like all their records, but I understand it's a completely different band, basically. Totally fine, totally understandable, but I mean, I even like the Crossed EP, so that kind of would have been a guilty pleasures, but it's on LP and I didn't bring it with me. But just imagine, you know, everything here I own that isn't just the first Sarcophago, I guess you could throw into this category too. All right. Next few releases. This one I have showed before, and the only reason I picked this one up was because I didn't know where my Fintroll CD was, but that's another example of a band. Same with bands like Children of Bodom. I don't think I actually own any of their music right now, which is kind of weird. I used to listen to them in high school, and back then I just wasn't buying a lot of CDs. It was mostly burnt CDs and other means of listening to music that I'm not so proud of. But this is pretty much in the same vein as Fintroll. It's the band, if I can pronounce it right, Korpiklani. So it's got that, you know, it's Nordic folk metal. I enjoy it. I like all the music by these kind of bands for the most part. There's really not much I don't like. You know, I've mentioned these guys, Fintroll, Insephirum, I think is how you pronounce it, kind of similar. Another band which just got a weird ass name, but Turisas? I don't know. It sounds just like freaking weird ass name, but they have an album called Battle Metal, kind of in this vibe, you know, very Nordic. They actually have a cover of the song Rasputin, so, but that's the kind of stuff you're not going to hear on other people's channel. Yeah, I tell you, I didn't bring it with me either, but bands like Dragon Force 2, The Reach for the Skies, power metal, folk metal, I think that stuff is way better than people give it credit for. And you don't always have to be serious. You don't always have to be heavy. Doesn't always have to be super brutal for it to be good metal. I mean, people love Dio. People love Rainbow and Ozzy and Motorhead and Priest. I mean, those aren't heavy or brutal or anything, even for their time. I mean, not really. I mean, kind of, but I think if you can give those a chance, and if you like them especially, I don't see why you wouldn't like a band like Korpiklani or Ailstorm. So shout out to Fraser Dawson. Yes, you were right. They are from Scotland, not Ireland. My bad, but bands like them, like, gotta give some of that stuff a chance, man. It's not that bad. I think if you really expand your mind to some of the different styles of metal out there, or don't even call it metal, then maybe it's easier for you to digest. I don't know. But so now we're really getting down and dirty with the really what people would consider guilty pleasures here. I have a few albums by this band. You've probably heard me mention them at least once, but that is the band Korn. I grew up with Korn. I started listening to them in 2014, 2015. I have 2 patches on my vest for the longest time. And video games, like for Xbox and PlayStation, you have to come up with a username. I was Korn fan. That was my name. I have the first 5 or 6 albums. I listened to them a lot, and that's kind of what got me into the harder music. You could even call this, you don't want to call it metal, you don't like new metal, call it hard rock, call it alternative rock, whatever. It doesn't matter to me, but a band like this got me into the heavier stuff. It's the alternative music. I could go on about how like bands like video games like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, Dave Mirra, BMX, all those like extreme sports games got me and probably a whole generation of people my age into like just alternative music. Whether you call it metal or not, metal adjacent, which is kind of what the next few albums are going to be, it got people into listening to something different than maybe what's presented on the radio. So maybe they heard their first punk song or their first ska song or their first hip hop or rap song or a collab. You know, I think in the second Tony Hawk, they have that song with Anthrax and there's some rapper, you know, that I think that song's in there. I forget what that is. Stuff like Rage Against the Machine and I'm sure like Godsmack and stuff. So yeah, the stuff that's kind of hard rock and maybe deplorable that people come up to you and go, hey man, I like Tool, Godsmack, and Rage Against the Machine. I'm just as metal as you, and it's not really metal. I get that. I understand that. But if you stop there and then you do claim that you're into the, you know, extreme metal stuff, yeah, I get it. You're not. That makes perfect sense to me, and I totally agree. But as like kind of a gateway, I definitely listen to some of that. I don't really listen to it anymore. So bands like Godsmack, Mudvayne, Breaking Benjamin, yeah, it is what it is. It played a part. I can't really say I miss any of that stuff. It was interesting, and I am kind of glad it existed because, again, it was like a stepping stone to eventually listening to like the light metal and then the heavier metal and the more extreme stuff. I mean, I'm glad it exists, but I think that it is necessary for some of the stuff. I guess I can understand if that is as far as you go and you think you listen to the extreme stuff, that's where it does get annoying, and I kind of agree. So, but another band, this band definitely is metal adjacent. Some people call them new metal. I don't really know how to actually really quantify where I would put their music, but I do enjoy it, especially, you're seeing a theme here. Back in high school, it's when I first listened to them, but it's the band System of a Down. I never got to see them live, unfortunately. That would have been kind of cool, but this was their first album here. This is their self-titled. I've owned all 5 of their albums. I don't know why I don't own them anymore. I think maybe I actually think I got them lost or thrown out or something, which to some of you might be out there cheering like, yeah, thank goodness. But I definitely enjoy Toxicity probably the most. And I own this and Steal This album. So where these guys actually fall in the list. I mean, people said they were new metal, and Surge came out and said, no, Korn is new metal. We're not really like that. Whatever. Again, this is sort of metal adjacent. I kind of struggled whether or not to put this and the next 2 bands on this list. They kind of fall in the metal category, kind of not. So whether you consider it metal or hard rock or whatever, this is definitely a band that would be considered for most people a guilty pleasure. But like I said, I started listening to it back when I really didn't know anything else, and this got me into the mood and the desire to listen to heavier stuff, and eventually ended up where I am now, where I listen to pretty much the whole spectrum of metal. So from the most extreme of the extremes to like the lightest and lamest, and so pretty much everything, and I have a band like that to credit for. This next one was really hard. I didn't know to put it on this list or to put it on the non-metal list. I technically do not define this band as a metal band. I think they're a grunge band. I think that's kind of obvious. Some people, I guess, do argue they are. I think back in the day, there was this whole controversy with Metallica bringing them on tour, and people booed them because they also didn't think they were metal, which I kind of agree, but I'm throwing them on the metal one anyways for whatever, you know, whether you think they are or not. Again, I don't personally. I'm just throwing them on this list. That is the band Alice in Chains with the album Dirt. I heard their compilation first, and when I look at this, most of the songs on here were also on their compilation. So these are kind of the greatest hits anyways. So songs like Them Bones, Rooster, Wood, Angry Chair, that's the kind of stuff that I like. That's the stuff I'm familiar with. So that's the crap that I know by them, and really that's it. So I even had a patch of them on my vest, but I took it off because didn't really fit the bill, so you got to draw the line somewhere. And then last but not least is a band that I definitely don't consider metal, except technically you could argue maybe their first album was. Okay, well, this is what happens when you shoot these videos in your parking lot. But it's the band Ghost. And I couldn't find any of my CDs for whatever reason, so I just decided to pick up the 7-inch that I have like 15 copies of because I'm crazy like that. But I own all their albums on CD and LP. I own their EPs. I own a few of their 7-inches. And I used to own some of their more rare stuff. I do have a live album by them, which I don't really care for that much. And I have 2 of their EPs. But that is a band that I also don't really consider metal. But I am a huge Ghost fan. I also love Repugnant. So whether you think they're metal or not kind of doesn't really matter, but I do enjoy them. I'm just never going to see them in concert because I don't have $200 for a balcony seat. So that is it for this video. I will see you in the next one.